Good evening, everyone. My name is Allison Sweeney, and I'm a humanities junior at Poolsville High School. I'd like to thank all of you for joining tonight's program, Artificial Turf Troubles at Our Schools and Playgrounds. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsor, Montgomery Green, a nonprofit organization promoting sustainability in our county, and our coordinator, Laura Barnett. SAPPlings stands for Student Advocates Protecting the Planet. We are a group open to county high school students in grades 9 through 12 who are interested in the environment and sustainability. It doesn't matter whether you attend public or private school or are homeschooled, you can be a part of the SAPPlings programs. We host online and live student forums, as well as workshops and public webinars. And you will soon see our contact details in the chat. Tonight's program is tackling an important environmental and health issue that is affecting our schools, parks, and playgrounds in Montgomery County. We encourage you to explore whether or not this is a concern in your community, and we will talk about ways that you can get involved. After our main presenter tonight, Dr. Kathleen Michaels, I'll introduce our other speaker on this issue. Then we will open the floor to questions and discussion. You can raise your hand to share your comments or put questions or comments in the chat. Please remember that this webinar is being recorded for internal purposes and should not be published outside. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Kathleen Michaels, who has a PhD in neurobiology and spent more than 30 years in biomedical research related to global public health. She and her Safe Healthy Planning field in the Sierra Club Maryland chapter colleagues have addressed plastic pollution in general and public synthetic turf fields and waste tire playground carpeting in particular for more than a decade. Kathy is a member of the board of directors for Montgomery Green, our sponsor tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michaels in her presentation on synthetic turf fields in our communities. Dr. Michaels, I think you're muted.
Kathy, you're on mute.
Sorry, somehow it said I was muted while I was pulling up the share screen, so I apologize. Let's try that again.
Also, my bad. This webinar is being recorded for our YouTube channel for Montgomery Green, and if you were to speak, then your comments will be recorded and posted to our YouTube.
All right, so I think we have it. Can you all see that? Great. Can you hear me? So I am, as Allison said, Kathleen Michaels. I am have been working on this issue for a long time, and I didn't think I would have to because I thought it would be common sense that we wouldn't want to pave our sports fields and playgrounds with plastic. But about 15 years after my son's high school, Montgomery Blair High School, fought a fight about whether to get synthetic turf or not, I'm still working on the issue. So let me just give a quick overview. What is synthetic turf? An average field is a little more than 2 acres. So just think of 2 acres of grass versus 2 acres of plastic, because the carpet, synthetic turf carpet, has about 40,000 pounds of plastic backing and blades. And this carpet is laid on top of usually a rock base and infilled with about 400,000 pounds of usually tire waste combined with silica sand or other infill material. And remember, this displaces grass and soil, which would otherwise filter pollutants and oxygenate the air. So just want to, we all agree that athletic fields are important and good for schools and the community, that they all should all be safe, cost efficient, and that everyone cares about the environment. Given that, we don't believe that synthetic turf fields meet these goals, and I'll explain why. Now, first of all, I mean, all of you are probably aware that we have a plastic problem in the world, not just our local localities, but plastic is everywhere. Microplastics, the chemicals that leach out of microplastics, they've been found in, microplastic pollution has been found in blood, placentas, our food, just about everywhere. So if you're worried about plastic waste, I just want you to get a visual of what we're talking about. A synthetic turf field is, the plastic in it is the equivalent of about 3.2 million plastic bags, or about 46 million plastic straws. And many of us, and myself included, are trying to end the use of single-use plastics, and things like disposable plastic bags and straws. But here we have synthetic turf fields, which are a huge source of this kind of plastic, and they degrade. And about 10% of 5 to 10% of a synthetic turf field breaks down every year. Let me go on to the, and when it does, of course, it ends up in the air, soil, and water. So just to kind of give an overview, this slide kind of captures just about everything about synthetic turf. So if you just have one slide that you want to use as a take home, this is it. First of all, unless you care an awful lot, nothing's going to get better, which is what we believe. And so we're trying to help the schools do better by students and the environment. Plastic in general, plastic synthetic turf is toxic. It's hard for the athletes. It's hot, much hotter than asphalt. It is injurious in the sense that athletes will have more lower extremity injuries in particular, and that's been proven by epidemiological studies. It produces waste. It's carbon intensive, just like all plastics in its manufacture. Unsustainable, it's not recyclable, and it's much more expensive than even the best grass fields. So what are the benefits? Why do this? Well, there's kind of a uniform type of field. It's like we call field in the box, and uniform care, and it looks great on video. And it looks great from the stands. So many adults in particular have never been on a synthetic turf field. It looks great to them. And that's part of the problem. Many people who see synthetic turf fields don't actually see them in the sense that they don't see them for what they are. They're not grass. They're plastic with all of the problems that plastic entails. So a literal hot mess as they degrade, as they heat up. So grass, why don't we just use grass? Well, the problems are that they need attention to and care that's specific to the climate and the use that they're going to get so that they'll thrive. Now, so do children. So does just every living thing, and they give us back a lot in benefits. They're durable, rain-out resistant at much lower cost than the plastic fields if they are constructed and maintained to be so, with, as I said, attention to climate and use-specific care. Additional benefits are the grass and soil oxygenate and cool the air, filter water, and are soft and sustainable. Should be a no-brainer, right, to go with grass. So just to give you some more information about problems about synthetic turf, because this is what we're dealing with all our schools. There's an infill that holds the blades upright, and typically it's ground up tires, which I'll mention later, are full of toxic compounds. They're not meant to be coming in contact with anything living, much less children or students or any human being. Couple of other options that are used are manufacturing waste, ground up shoes, for example, that's the Nike grind, and then something that's an oxymoron, envirofill, which is plastic coated sand. So they take something that's natural sand and they coat it with plastic. I'll just leave that there. Now, the problem with the infill is that it both the infill and the plastics break down and they run off the field. So synthetic turf is like a microplastic Trojan horse in the sense that it delivers a concentrated source of tire and plastic microparticles and fibers to places and watersheds and soils and humans that would otherwise not see that type of contamination. So it's an unnecessary point source. That's an important thing to think about, a point source of a huge amount of plastic pollution that doesn't need to happen. And here's just some more pictures of, this is actually Walter Johnson High School. Their synthetic turf before they now have a replacement synthetic turf, but this was for years, for many years before they replaced it. This is what it looked like. You can see the tire crumb, that's the black material on the surface. This green is all the disintegrating fibers. And then this is, when it's was rolled up to be removed. And it was sent just to give you an idea of the, they talk about recycling, that they're going to recycle it. There is no recycling of synthetic turf. They sent this to Malaysia and then essentially lost it, literally lost it. We were tracking it, asking questions, and then it disappeared. So they spent a lot of money to send it to Malaysia, which they shouldn't do anyway. And that's a whole nother discussion. Developed countries aren't supposed to be sending their waste to low-income countries, but this field was. But as you can see, there's all that plastic pollution. Where does it go? Where do the particles go? Where does the blades, the microplastics go? They go to waterways. And whoop, what did I just do there? Sorry. Okay. And that middle one, it says no pollute, do not pollute, drains to waterways. Ironic, because as you can see down in that drain, there's tire crumb, and tire crumb has a lot of pollutants in it, and the fibers, as you saw. So the industry itself says that up 1 to 5 tons of microplastics per field per year come off a shed off of the field, and that they you need to add that much to the field. So what happens to that? It gets washed away with rainwater, it clings to socks and shoes, washes down drains, and then just during maintenance gets sent, into the air, soil, and water. So the industry itself knows that this is a problem. This isn't something we're making up. Now, one of the other problems is all the chemicals in synthetic turf. Now, the tire crumb has a myriad of chemicals, and I have a slide later that I'll talk about those a little bit. But one of the most alarming chemical recently, in addition to chemicals about in plastics to make them soft, phthalates and things like that, are the perfluorinated chemicals, the PFAS. Forever chemicals that you may have heard of. They are what makes synthetic turf possible to manufacture, because it keeps the blades from sticking to the machinery that makes it. And they are in synthetic turf. The industry has admitted that. So when students are playing on it, they're getting exposed to it, and it's been shown that it leaches out into the environment. So just to give you an idea of some of the undisclosed toxins in synthetic turf, the plastic carpet has hormone disrupting chemicals, neurotoxins, immune system disruptors, and carcinogens. such as phthalates, antioxidants, plasticizers, and heavy metals in the pigments such as lead and cadmium. And as I mentioned, the PFAS chemicals. The tire crumb, if that's used instead of one of the alternatives, has over 300 toxins that have been identified, or toxic substances, including just the fine particulates themselves. Carbon black is the material that actually makes a tire black, and there's and it's a very fine particle. You don't want to breathe that in, and you don't want it to get into the waterways. There's also neurotoxins that have been identified in tire crumb, such as lead, hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are carcinogenic, hormone disrupting phthalates, and volatile organic compounds such as benzene, and then aquatic toxins. So it's not just human beings that can suffer from these toxins, but zinc and a recently identified chemical called 6-PPD is highly toxic to salmon, and potentially to other fish and maybe humans as well. So all in all, you do not want tire crumb. You don't want tires ground up and exposed, basically thrown out into the environment to have humans and aquatic organisms be exposed to it. In the US right now, there's probably more than 20,000 since I did this slide, synthetic turf fields. That's more than 72 million square feet. Right now, mostly tire rubber crumb for infill. Just an enormous amount of poundage. In Europe, there's over 50,000 synthetic turf installations because they started earlier, but they're also pushing back right now and banning the infill. There's a big fight. The industry, of course, doesn't want them to do that, but they realize the problems. And I want you to remember that all this plastic is displacing grass and soil, which would otherwise filter pollutants and oxygenate the air. So it's bad enough that they're polluting, but they're also displacing something that would actually be beneficial. So here's a number of resources, but before I get into this, I'd like to mention some of the other problems with synthetic turf, and these were in my Canva presentation, which I wasn't able. I was trying to use a new platform, and I just couldn't get it to work. So injuries, and Chris will talk a little bit about that. There's higher rates of injuries on synthetic turf, partly because when an athlete is on the field and turns, you see all those divots on natural grass, and people complain about the looks of the divots. Well, that's what's giving way instead of the athlete's knees or ankles. The other, so joint injuries are a big problem. Synthetic turf also gets very hard because really it's just a rug on top of rocks. So concussions, particularly for sports where they don't wear helmets, such as soccer, is a huge problem when you're running on something that looks like it should be soft. So you're running on this plastic carpet that looks like grass. You play as if it was soft. If you were running on concrete, you would run and do things differently. So it's fooling the athletes basically into thinking that they're running on something soft, and they have more, they're more likely to end up with head to surface contact and concussions. And there's one of the problems is there are no regulations on synthetic turf. There is something called GMAX for hardness, but right now the school system is using an outdated number that even the industry doesn't use. The industry uses a much lower number. So students should be aware that they're not even being protected at the level that that industry tells them that they should. So they're using what's called 200 GMAX, that impact level, instead of 165, which is what the industry recommends. So the other point I wanted to make was heat. synthetic turf, both the plastic and the tire crumb, but even the plastic carpeting alone is much hotter than even asphalt. I want you to take that in. It's the hottest surface out there. Rubber and plastic are hotter than anything as far as the surfacing that we put out there right now. I mean, when I say hotter, it can be 40, 50, 60 degrees hotter. Synthetic turf has been measured at 170, 180, 190 degrees. Many parents, athletes, there's been studies done. They use those infrared thermometers that people are now familiar with from COVID, taking people's temperature. And you can just aim it at the surface and you can see how hot they get. This is not something that we want in a warming climate, and it's not something we should be exposing athletes to. And again, there are no guidelines and no regulations for surface temperature. The school systems are using something called a wet bulb temperature that they'll tell you about, but that does not take into account surface temperature. So that's something all athletes and students should remember, and they should ask about, because they're still not being protected adequately, even with the new ways of measuring temperature. The wet bulb temperature takes into account humidity, but not the surface temperature of synthetic turf. So I thought maybe, Chris, if you could jump in a little bit on your experiences as a coach, and particularly with playing, the heat injuries, that would be great to round out that experiential aspect with the synthetic turf.
Sure. Good to see everybody. I have my 9-month-old here with me. My name is Chris Wilhelm. I'm a teacher at Northwood High School. And as of last year, I was the varsity boys soccer coach. And my experience with artificial turf began as a player. And I was a goalkeeper at Blair High School and then at the college level. And we have, there's a lot of opinions about artificial turf in the sports world, but where people have, and especially the high school athletes have started to land recently, is that they just see their friends getting injured at a very, very high rate on artificial turf fields. Sorry. And we saw this at the high school level in soccer last season. We played against Paint Branch High School, who has an artificial turf field, and we played them at the beginning of the year, and we played them again at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, 2 of their senior soccer players were on the sideline before the game with serious knee injuries that they had picked up at the beginning of the season on their artificial turf field. And in that same game, one of our star players injured his ankle in a way that would never have happened on a natural grass field and was out for more than a month. So, these are anecdotes, but they're things that are happening right here in Montgomery County in every sport that's happening on, that's taking place on an artificial turf field. Kids are getting hurt, and MCPS has taken a long time to even begin listening to some of the activists on this issue. Kathy's been fighting on this, and several other activists, for a long time. But I think that the number of injuries that are starting to pile up is starting to get people's attention, and it's really terrible that that's kind of the way that this is happening, but it's true. And it's not only here in Montgomery County. Across the country, for example, the United States women's national soccer team, which is, everybody knows, much more successful than the men's team, they had to take the United States Soccer Federation, which is basically the head body of soccer in the United States. The women's team had to take them to court to demand that they not play on artificial turf fields anymore, because the rates of injury were so much higher, and they're actually even higher for female athletes. Female athletes have higher rates of knee injuries than male athletes, especially on artificial turf fields. So these issues have been piling and piling and piling. And, it's just time that student athletes and parents get together and just don't let MCPS ignore this issue anymore, because the default has been every time a school gets a new field, it's an artificial turf field. And one of the reasons for that is that parent groups, especially kind of football programs and booster clubs who run the athletic departments, they have thought of artificial turf fields as desirable and actually as kind of an equity issue. It's like, well, we don't want to have a bad natural grass field. And the reality is that there's no reason why we should have to have bad natural grass fields. The Montgomery County Parks Department has beautiful, durable natural grass fields all over the county. Any soccer player who plays in Montgomery County has played in the Germantown Soccerplex on their beautiful natural grass fields. And there's no reason that MCPS can't have fields like that for less money than we're paying for these harmful artificial turf fields. So, as a coach, as a player, as a future soccer parent, hopefully, I think it's time to, I'm really excited that people are starting to pay attention to this. And I'm hoping that by the time my son is old enough to be playing soccer in Montgomery County, that the pendulum will have swung back the other way, and that we'll be installing beautiful natural grass fields that are much safer for our student athletes.
Thank you, Chris. Allison, I don't know if you want to open it up for questions or, and I was going to follow up just on what Chris was saying about Montgomery County, because I think, any students in Montgomery County who want to know, right now, the school system would like to put synthetic turf in at all the high schools. And I believe there's, I should have gotten the numbers solid in my head, but I think there's 12 out of the 29 right now that have synthetic turf, if that's correct. And a number of them are up for replacement. Now, one of the rationales that they give for synthetic turf is that lower cost of maintenance, which it turns out isn't true if they do what needs to be done for the safety of the athletes. So actually, grass and synthetic turf are about the same. And the initial cost of installation of the synthetic turf is so much higher that, it blows any maintenance, future maintenance costs differentials out of the water. And recently, just at a Board of Education meeting the other day, and I'm not sure if Laura Stewart's on, but they brought up there was an item that was brought up, and they were hoping that it would just slide through and nobody would question it, but it was questioned for $250,000, so $250,000 for, there she is. Okay, there's Laura Stewart. She might want to address this, but for synthetic turf infill. And one of the reasons that's important to think about in this, everything we're talking about and advocating, is the other rationale that they gave for these fields is that all the costs were going to, so whatever you paid for that field, and there was a contract that was built in that was something like $10,000 for each synthetic turf field, that would be it. That's the cost. Now, all of a sudden, they're asking for $250,000, $250,000 for infill for synthetic turf fields that was supposed to be built into all the contracts. Now, just remember, you could pay for 6 to 12 grass fields to be upgraded for that money. You could pay for maintenance for a long time on a lot of grass fields for that money. And the rationale they give for going to synthetic turf is that they don't have the money. But all of a sudden, this money that could go for a whole lot of grass fields, they want just for infill for synthetic turf, which isn't even going to last that long. So this is like an obscenely large amount of money that, so something you should all be aware of if you're, want to advocate not just for the health and safety, but for the the fiscal, part of this whole problem. So, Laura, would you like to weigh in at all?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to add just for 1 second. Oh, Allison, I see Allison has someone with her who can really speak to this personally. So, but
Oh, I
I'm
was
just
talking
gonna,
about Laura. Yes, that's
Yes,
exactly
Lauren's
who
here.
Yes,
yeah.
that Laura.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to introduce Laura Stewart here, who is the Capital Improvement Plans Committee Chair of MCC PTA, who is the MCPS PTA countywide group, who has direct experience advocating for the hardness, like lowering the hardness of synthetic turf fields to like reduce student injuries, and has recently done an analysis of how this is impacting students and where it's really dangerous to have synthetic turf fields.
Sure. Just to let you know that every high school on the MCPS website, if you just Google MCPS artificial turf GMAX, GMAX, you will see a link to all these reports, and you have to kind of click through. But they tested them all in August. And if it's the GMAX score is the hardness. If it's 165 or over, that is considered not appropriate for play by the NFL and the Synthetic Turf Council. If it's at 200, it's actually considered life-threatening. Wootton High School had a spot in August that tested at 199. Other fields tested it like in the 90s. So if that gives you an idea, 199 and 200, I don't think really makes much of a difference. So I have a feeling some of that extra, that 250,000 in infill might be going to Wootton to help the impact of that field. We'll see. And then Gaithersburg is another troublesome field that tested all the way up to, I think, 189. So I'm trying to alert those communities that those kids are at a higher risk of a very bad concussion because we're hitting the ground when it's that hard. That's why it's dangerous. So that's one issue. By the way, they're both ending their lifespans. They were, I think, installed in 2012. So they're going to have to basically replace those fields. And yes, they plan on replacing them with artificial turf. The other issue I see that happened at Richard Montgomery and some other fields they put zeolite on is the slipperiness and abrasiveness. And we've seen a lot of horrible turf burns, like really bad turf burns. And so the zeolite is not working out. It was promised to be the best new thing. People tried to warn them. They kind of laughed about it. But guess what? Now they're going to have to replace all the zeolite, which went to my kids' high school, Einstein High School. So I think they're going to have to end up replacing all of that. So what, again, that $250,000 because the promise wasn't kept by the companies, even though we did try to warn MCPS this might not be appropriate. So, these are the issues that's happening every day to kids. And I think Chris talked about some of that. And yet they still want to double down on artificial turf. So we asked about, I brought up the hardness at the MCPS BOE meeting, Board of Education meeting on Tuesday. And there was a discussion. So if you want to go back and look at the discussion, at the end of the meeting, they had a full discussion on their plans on bringing in 5 more artificial turf fields at the high school level. And they think that this is the way to go because guess what? It's not the turf of 10 years ago. It's new and improved. Wow, I think we heard that 3 years ago. It's not the old turf. It was new and improved, and probably heard that 5 years before that. So this is a constant story we hear, and yet there's always issues, not to mention all the plastic. So I hope that we could get together and use the power of the youth voice to at least get a pilot state-of-the-art grass field that's properly installed, that maybe has irrigation. You can even put sensors now in the ground. So if you don't need irrigation, it'll automatically turn it off. You know, let's put some money into grass instead of just putting the minimal into grass and saying it doesn't work. They will say it doesn't have as much hours of use, but if, you know,
How do they quantify that?
hours of use. So that's a great question, because there are some times where you're not going to be able to use your grass fields. It's not that often, but there will be times. We have to be real about this. But what's the trade-off? Okay, so what they'll say is that artificial turf is cheaper because there'll be no downtime, right? You could use it forever and ever, even though eventually it degrades. They still say that. So we have to be careful about the way they say the cost, because they will make it sound like artificial turf is cheaper because of hours of use. But I think it's not responsible to not try to at least do a great grass field. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. Sure. Yes, Dr. Michaels.
Yeah, I just wanted the whole hour of use thing is, first of all, they don't mention that they have to restrict play when it's hot. And by hot, I mean, you know, greater than 75, 80 degrees air temperature, which you don't have to restrict on grass fields, but you do on synthetic turf. So they try to, you know, they try to put the hours of use outside of the hottest periods of the day, even on days that, you know, under, you know, typical circumstances on grass wouldn't be too hot. So they're not taking that into account. And a grass field that is appropriately constructed and appropriately maintained doesn't can be made almost rain out proof. And that's usually what they're talking about when they're talking about hours of play. When they're talking about hours of play on synthetic turf, first of all, if you have one field, most people want to use it at the same times. And the more that you use that field, the faster it's going to break down. And what I didn't mention earlier, and in case people aren't aware, synthetic turf fields are only warranted to last for 8 years. And most, I think the average is about 8. In Montgomery County, we have a really bad track record of the fields that are don't safely last beyond 6 or 7 or 8 years. The one Walter Johnson lasted, but they had to keep dumping the infill on it so that it would pass the GMAX tests. Same with Richard Montgomery. Montgomery Blair was replaced at 6 years because it was too hard. So this whole hours of play issue is a red herring. The other thing you'll notice is students take a look around, the grass fields in general are not fenced in, particularly the the practice fields. The synthetic turf fields are always fenced in and locked up. So the hours of play actually are, it's kind of fictional because people are running on the grass fields all the time. They're not protected, they're not fenced, whereas they can't be running on the synthetic fields all the time because they are fenced. So they're kind of gaming the system, gaming the numbers in turn when they're talking about hours of play, in addition to the other issues that I raised.
If I could just jump in here for a quick second, I just wanted to share with everyone that in the chat, I did provide a link to a Google document. It's a list of known artificial turf fields in Montgomery County. Actually, it's throughout Maryland, but if you look at that link, you will see a list of artificial turf fields throughout the state of Maryland. And if you go to page 14, you will begin to see the list of schools and other facilities in the county that are artificial turf and when they were installed. And I also just wanted to throw, I will try to monitor questions in the chat. So we've got this question a couple of times, so let me throw it out there to you. Who specifically decides on artificial turf versus grass? Is it the school board? How do we best advocate for grass fields?
Good question. Does anyone, I don't know if Laura's still here. Is Laura still with you, Allison?
I think she's listening in. We're in another meeting right now. So I ran and got her because I'm like, oh, just come in. You were just testifying for this. Like totally just come speak.
Yeah, so Chris might want to weigh in. I mean, a lot of it, Coach Wilhelm has testified at the Board of Education. Laura Stewart has testified. I've testified. And what we keep getting told by the Board of Education is they need more students and coaches. So students individually have stepped up. Molly, I forget her last name, Wittenhouse. There's several students who were torn up on the new synthetic turf at Richard Montgomery and Whitman, who went to the Board of Education themselves and testified, which got the fields closed down, and they're trying to quote unquote fix them. But we haven't had a concerted effort by the students to say, wait a minute, grass can be done better. And synthetic turf isn't working. You know, it's hot, it's toxic, and it's tearing us up, and it's hard. It's like, why are you doing this to us? So there are some Board of Education members who are asking good questions and asking good follow-up questions of MCPS, but we need the students to start asking questions directly and to unifying. So that's really the bottom line when it comes to the school system. And I mentioned Laura because she's works with the MCCPTA, or is part of the MCCPTA, and has a lot of good tips if students are interested in getting more information, volunteering. We can the SAPPlings can, I think, maybe help to be a conduit. I'll let Allison speak to that, and Laura.
Yes.
But I had put in the chat, you can email and use the contact us link at safehealthyplayingfields.org, and I'll put that in the chat again. And there's other groups, the Sierra Club are working on it. So we're more than we, meaning a lot of people in Montgomery County, throughout the country, are more than happy to help students. And there's grass experts out there. Now, the thing is, the grass experts are kind of, they're professionals. They're not an industry, but they really want to get more students involved in what is actually a really lucrative profession. There's a lot of a call for sports field managers who know science, who know about soil science, who know about how to make fields better. It's actually an amazing, I've learned a lot. I never thought I'd want to know about sports fields, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff that goes on when you deal with a living system. And there is a Turfgrass Academy at the Soccerplex, and that's something else that students might want to look into. But that's another resource that students can draw on if they're interested in advocating for grass.
Mm-hmm. In advocating for grass, what are means that students can take in their own schools or just their local communities? How do we get students to come testify to the board if they're very new to advocacy, or feel like this thing seems really daunting?
Oh, wow, really good question, because that gets to advocacy in general, how to start advocating. And, it makes me think we kind of need to do an advocacy 101 for students, within. So depending on the issue, so for this issue, there's several points at which you would want to, so you want to try to get your school behind you. So you want to talk to the athletic director, you want to talk to coaches. The The athletic directors often are pushing for synthetic turf because they just want this, like I mentioned at the beginning, this kind of, field in a box that they don't have to think about. Now, the reason they have to think about it a lot right now, again, is because the school system, number one, isn't constructing the fields appropriately from the beginning, which they could be. I mean, they use them for the staging, as the staging area for construction equipment, and then they just throw sod down. That's not installing an appropriate field. That's not laying a foundation. They should know better. This is a school system that's trying to give students an appropriate foundation. Well, grass is a living system, also needs an appropriate foundation. So they can advocate for their school systems or their athletic directors for the boosters to actually get behind them to ask for better grass fields. And then now you won't always get those people behind you, and because they're in, whatever, they've kind of bought into the synthetic turf industry PR, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. But you can go to the school board and so learn who the board members are. They're happy to hear from students individually or in groups. And Laura could probably give more information on, how to approach them. But you can email individual board members. You can email them as a group. There's, I think it's boe@mcpsmd.org.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And then the other, so who actually approves funding ultimately is the county council. So the other thing that I recommend to all students, for not just for this issue, but all issues, is to find out who their county council members are. And I mean, a lot of adults don't know. A lot of people of voting age don't know, and a lot of you will be voting age soon. So you'll have a role in both the Board of Ed and the county council. Oh, and remember, in the Board of Ed, there is a student member.
Yes.
Of the board. So you can actually talk to the student member. And again, I don't know what the student members know about this issue, but you can educate the students.
Definitely. There's a student member advisory committee that all students are welcome to be a part of. The current SMOB or student member has a monthly meeting where students can sort of gauge their interests and their priorities as an avenue between the students and the board. And so that's a really accessible way to get involved. You don't need to be on his his cabinet or anything. Just show up and tell him what you care about. Dr. Michaels, we have a question from Lydia about tire cushioning and tot lots. What are the kind of chemicals that are involved in those in especially residential areas?
Right, that's a really good question. Thank you, Lydia. Yeah, so we're talking about schools and the synthetic turf, but as I mentioned, tire crumb is one of the things that's used often, for the cushioning on the plastic fields, so that they won't be hard. And then the industry had the bright idea of using it for playgrounds instead of the engineered wood fiber. There's a number of materials that can be used for playgrounds. The main thing for playgrounds is for them to be impact protective if a child falls from a certain height. The gold standard is something called engineered wood fiber, which also is accessible to wheelchairs. So they mill wood to knit together and then install it in layers. And it just has to be, raked occasionally and installed correctly, just like everything, raked occasionally and topped up occasionally. But that is kind of the gold standard. It's impact protective, it's healthy, and wheelchairs can roll on it. What they've been doing, because again, it's easier and it looks pretty to adult eyes, and they're not the ones playing on the playground. They've been using the tire waste. And as you recall, the tires get hotter than asphalt, way hotter. So the children, and we kind of have this campaign that we're starting, No Child Fried Outside, because the children are literally being, you send them out in the playground and it's 150, 160, 170, 180 degrees. Hotter than, people say, well, what about the plastic slides? They get hot, but not that hot. The rubber is incredibly hot. And
Where can you
so,
find stats on the heat of these materials?
there are papers, there's information I can give in the links of resources. There's a lot of studies, both formal and informal on the heat. And you yourselves can go out there, go to any local playground on a sunny day, you know, hot 75, 8, you know, I mean, below 70 degrees, you'll still see the temperature differential if it's in the sun. So you can just see it that, but, and it's easy to get those infrared thermometers, and we're Safe Healthy Playing Fields. One of the things, we got a grant at one point to get a lot of them. We can also share those with students who are asking. So if you get in touch with us, we're happy to supply you with those thermometers and actually enroll you in kind of an outreach or a investigative unit, you know, where you're going out and actually taking temperatures and reporting them back. But yeah, so these things are really hot and they're not a good idea. And that's the other thing that students, if they're willing to, can advocate for.
Thank you so much for your expertise in coming on and sharing with both high school students and parents and just people who care about this. I'd like to pass it back to Laura Barnett so she can close us off and talk about future opportunities with Montgomery Green and ways to get involved and stay connected.
Thank you. I just really want to say thanks to Kathy and Chris for coming on tonight, because this is such an important topic and you have really given us a lot of good information tonight. I'm going to just ask you a really quick question, or I hope it's a really quick question. What, you know, if students want to be involved in this, is there an ongoing organized way for them to participate in any campaigns or legislation or work that you have for the coming year?
We so they can get in touch with us, again, safehealthyplayingfields.org, and I will also put my contact information. Diana Conway is the president of safehealthyplayingfields.org. If you go to if you go to that website, and go to the contact us page, or I'm typing now as we or email me, or well, I'll put my email address in here right now. So that's one way to get involved, and we could, you know, one of the things that SAPPlings, if they're interested, could again be perhaps a conduit as well. And right now we don't really have a youth component to Safe Healthy Playing Fields as far as advocacy. We would love to develop one. I think that's the only way we're going to make headway on this issue, because the adults are just who are responsible just aren't listening to their fellow adults and scientists. Chris?
Just quickly, I put an email in the chat, Kristen at kristenmink.com. Kristen Mink is, hopefully if she wins the general election in a couple weeks, is going to be the new council member for County Council District 5. And she is very interested in this issue. Before she ever ran for office, she testified on this issue and specifically wants to work with youth all over the county to on advocacy. So you can get in touch with her at that email address, and I'll be working with her on that issue as well. So we want to make sure that, you know, we need to be talking to all elected officials in Montgomery County to start sounding the alarm on this issue. And it's even more effective if that effort is led by youth. So we want to hear from you.
And the Sierra Club is also working on the issues. So, and I can put the link on that for that. And so we can also get you involved with the Zero Waste Committee, particularly of the Sierra Club. And that's something I didn't get a chance to mention today, although it was on the resources page that I posted. We're continuing to try to legislate for accountability and transparency in where these fields are going when they're taken away. and it's called the Chain of Custody Bill. Mary Lehman of District 21 is the main sponsor in the Maryland House of Representatives. Last year, it actually passed the House, but never really got a hearing in the Senate for a whole variety of reasons. There's been it's been difficult over the years to get any synthetic turf legislation passed because there's a lot of politics involved. I'll just put it that way. And anyone who that's something we could talk about some more with any students as to how the political system works, because that's the other level that you can advocate at, is at the state level. So we're talking about the county, but the state level, we're actually trying to get some accountability so that these fields aren't just tossed, which they have been, on the sides of rivers and ravines, on the sides of mountains, shipped to Malaysia. As I said,
Wow.
Walter Johnson was. And so this state law is basically just for accountability. We're not trying to ban them at this point. We're just trying to get accountability on the waste. And as one of the students who is involved in testifying said, they really need this information as tools, because it is your generation, all the young people who will have to deal with all of this waste that is currently being just tossed out into the environment, and all the forever chemicals that are associated with them that are likewise being tossed out into the environment. So we want some transparency and accountability, at least in tracking and tracing. So a chain of custody.
God.
And I can give people more information on that as well.
There is just a lot to know about this issue and a lot of different angles to address it from. Thank you so much, both of you, for tonight's program. And I want to thank Allison for moderating tonight as one of our SAPPlings. And our SAPPling contact information is in the chat somewhere there. I think you will see it. But before we go, I wanted to also share, just say a shout out to One Montgomery Green, who is our sponsor. And I hope that, you all will check them out, because they're committed to sustainability, and they have made it possible for us to support our high school students who are really leaders on the environment and sustainability issues. So that's great. But there's one other thing. I'm going to put it in the chat right now before we sign off tonight. I want to make sure everyone knows that the next SAPPlings webinar is going to be on melting glaciers, rising seas on November 10th with Professor Dr. Richard Alley, who is a professor of geosciences, and he was the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore in 2007. So this is a really, really great speaker who's going to be coming out for us on November 10th. And he's going to be talking about the Thwaites Glacier, also known as the Doomsday Glacier, and what that could mean for the world and for Maryland's coastal areas when it finally cuts loose, which could be very soon. So it's an important one. It's going to be a very interesting one. Hope you were there. But thank you again, everyone, tonight. Allison, if you have anything else you want to say, you want to sign off for everybody, we will do so. And I really appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure being here with you all tonight and hearing from amazing speakers, people who are really passionate about this. Definitely spearheading with the youth voice is going to be the next critical step in making sure that real grass fields are being implemented and considered as viable options. So students